I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this special event that the Kinder Institute is co-sponsoring with the Baker Institute and co-sponsoring with the Center for Houston's Future and with Houston Tomorrow. A chance to hear from one of the great experts on what's happening to cities across America. This is Robert Lang, professor of sociology and the director of the Brookings Mountain West at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV. He's also the director of the Lincy Institute at UNLV. In addition, currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a fellow of the Urban Land Institute, both in Washington, D.C. And in 2008, he was a Fulbright fellow at the École Normale Supérieure at Paris. Only he says he lectured in English. I thought that was very bad. And in 2006, he was a visiting distinguished professor at Arizona State University, also recently a planning and development fellow of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a distinguished visiting fellow at the University of California, Riverside. Prior to joining UNLV in 2009, up until 2009, he was a professor and director of urban affairs and planning program at Virginia Tech in Alexandria, Virginia. A tremendously prolific writer, one of the people you turn to get a sense of where cities are evolving and what's happening across America, and we're enormously pleased that he's here with us today. He's going to be speaking on the Texas Triangle, Megapolitan Houston's integration into the state, national, and global economies. Texas Triangle, he thinks, is positioned to be one of the most important and powerful of the 10 densely settled economic engines that Lang has called American megapolitan clusters. So without further ado, let me introduce Rob Lang, and thank you very much for being here.
Can you hear me? They wired me up so I could walk around. Okay. We'll see if this works. Yep. This book... you know it's a torturous process when you flip who's the lead author. And I actually did that in this book. I was the original lead author, but the co-author had to rerun all of the data because the first iteration was before the Great Recession. And it changed everything. It changed all the economic projections, all the population projections. So the data you see presented here reflects where we are now. And in fact, it brought down some regions were more impacted. Interestingly, this is one of the least impacted because this is one of the most successful regions of the moment in the middle of this recession. But a Phoenix or a Las Vegas's numbers were radically altered because they were on such a strong growth trajectory. So Chris Nelson, who's Arthur C. Nelson, but known as Chris, who's at the University of Utah, both of us began this project when we were jointly at the Virginia Tech and just outside of D.C. in Old Town Alexandria. There's a graduate campus there. And then we both, interestingly enough, moved to the West and finished the book while we were out West with the new spirit of the West, if you will. And again, this state, this region, Dallas as well, Austin and San Antonio figure very prominently in it. And I have a ton of data, and stop me if you want. We have 15 minutes Q&A or something to that effect at the end, but I'll be happy to address it. It's a small enough crowd. I'll take any kind of question you want as we go through. Where we started was that in the 1960s, people were already projecting to the turn of the century. By 65, 66, 67, people were like, what's the world going to look like in 2000? I was a little kid then, and they promised me like flying saucers. And I wound up, in traffic. So I'm still a little bitter about the whole, by phone is better than I would have guessed. They got the phones. Who knew? The phones would be so great. But we would be stuck. We'd need the phones because we're stuck in traffic. So there's a researcher who was at the Urban Land Institute, and the reason I know about it is I'm a fellow of the Urban Land Institute. They let me at their archives. And in the 1960s, the Urban Land Institute, which is a real, a collection of very large developers, was doing great work projecting out the U.S. metropolitan scale and growth with almost the exact right population to 2000. And the only region these are all regions above 1 million, they only missed, this guy is Jerome Pickard, they only missed in southern Nevada, Las Vegas. The only place that was over 1 million by 2000 that no one had predicted in that period. Other than that, everything else is correct, essentially, including some of the scaling. And so the contiguous development in Northeast Midwest together, after that California, Florida, and then you see Texas is well represented. This is, let's see, going forward. This is the 2005 original geography that I did at the start of this project. What I saw was the 2000 census showed a very different scale of growth than previous decades. It showed an enormous expansion between and at the fringes of cities. So I started to look and do analysis on flows in cities. And at that point, the Regional Plan Association of New York, which I'll show their map in a moment, was interested in large-scale metropolitan growth as well. And so was the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, which funded a lot of the original research. And the foreword of the book that's out there is written by Armando Carbonell. And by the way, sorry about the cost of the book. It's the color maps that Chris Nelson was obsessed with. We did all these great maps. He's like, you can't do the book without the maps. And each one of those maps is like $1 or something like that, in the bottom line. I can tell you it's the American Planning Association Press. They were very generous. Most of my books are with the Brookings Institution Press, what with me being at the Brookings Institution for 15 years. And they would never have let me get away with that. They'd have been like, one map, that's it. We want the thing to go for $20. So this is the original geography. And what happened is we got that into the USA Today. And that is the mayor of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And they have apparently a slogan, you see Dallas, Oklahoma City, that said, Dallas is coming our way. And what this originally was, the reason this is prominent, is that this was a lot of not just clustering of population, but goods flows. So you see the whole corridor. It's almost like that famous road that your governor wanted to build, the controversial road, the 40,000 lane wide, train, rail, everything, freight, right? That every farmer in Central Texas freaked out over because it would take eminent domain cases for the next 100 years to clear it all. That corridor from really Mexico to the Midwest is still, heavily traveled and united by certain industries like energy, for example. Business 2.0, the publication, got a hold of this map, and we ran all the projection data to, at that point, 2030. And they came up, you can't see all the little language on here, but they came up with this nice little set of vignettes on each region with these impressive little skyscrapers, which I think is kind of neat. This is the Regional Plan Association of New York in 2007. Came out with their definitive map. And what they do is different than what I do, and I think it bears some understanding, because what we projected is, and I'll show in a second the sort of mechanics of it, is an attempt to figure out what the census's official U.S. geography would be of 2040. The census doesn't give you the future geography. They only tell you where you've been. And part of the problem, one of the challenges in urban planning, is projection, knowing what to plan for in the next 30 or 40 years. So given that both Chris and I are really out of planning, and that's most of our academic and publication affiliation is in that literature, that's sort of the premium. And it's true in real estate as well. The biggest market for any of the work we've done so far are real estate developers on large scale. And they have put a fortune into this book in a way because they have paid for a lot of the data analysis that's behind it. So there's, sort of a little kind of cottage industry out of these projections, and the way we've taken these projections and translated into real estate. We could do housing, commercial development demanded, and all these other kind of formula that we've worked out. A lot of which is in the book. A lot of this is, right away I had to go to Phoenix and drop off a bunch of books to some of my friends there who are dead in the water and hopeful that the rest of the country is growing. Probably hoping that, Texas is growing enough to cover for them. In the RPA's geography, the interesting thing is they have the Texas Triangle, as you can see down there, but they took the Gulf Coast part that I was working on as well, and this is the hinge city right here. This is the only region in their view that's in two separate orbits. They couldn't make up their mind to put you in one or the other. I thought it was kind of cool. So that's the distinction. You're the only one. Dallas doesn't even get that. We can make fun of Dallas here, right? Kind of a rivalry? Okay. And incidentally, Dallas and Fort Worth figure in this analysis as well. Dallas and Fort Worth were the original metroplex, the original two cities that were about 30, 40 miles apart that used to be at war with one another. That when modern post-war suburbanization spread, understood that they were in the same region, and especially understood it because the federal government at one point told them, you're in the same region, which was, they asked for an airport at the same time. Now, I'm sure many Texans know that the last flight that Kennedy took was between Fort Worth and Dallas. And there's two separate airports. And so both regions came to the federal government and said, we'd like a new airport. It's kind of what we do now. They were building infrastructure then. Getting was good at those years. And the federal government said, well, here's what our we have some people at a gray desk in Suitland, Maryland, that say you're in the same metropolitan area. So you're going to have to suck it up and get one airport. They put it on the county line. And of course, Dallas got the sweet side of the, all the air terminals are really closer to Dallas than they are Fort Worth. Dallas found a way to stick it to Fort Worth. But Fort Worth at one point, again, they're rivals. Dallas has these kind of airs, these eastern cosmopolitan airs. And Fort Worth is celebratory, a cow town. And so famously, I've been told by residents of the regions that if you had to go to a business lunch in one or the other, you brought your lunch rather than stimulate the other partner's economy. But the power of the federal government, with its ability to just give you a big, giant airport is such that, play nice or you don't get one. And at first, this was a reluctant marriage. But in time, the rebranding of the region, which was originally called North Texas, they did focus groups. People thought North Texas meant cattle. So they had to come up with something that was, this is a big metropolis. And they came up with the Metroplex. And now they're one unified metropolitan area. They're not even, a sort of halfway metropolitan area. And that's happened in, Baltimore and D.C. It's happening right now in places like Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston, and so on. And the process continues. This is just a look we took and went on a little project with China, and some folks there wanted us to map out their space and compare it with our space, and that's our 2008 iteration of the methods. We've changed a few times. We used to have a requirement you had to get to 5 million. We fixed the county problems that we had. It took a lot of tweaking to get this finally. This is Richard Florida's mega regions that are closer to RPAs. And this is actually satellite imagery. It's the brightness of intensity of night sky. Now, one of the reasons we didn't go for that is that you could look contiguous by lights and have very different economic function. And the way the census defines historically, since the statistic was first invented in the early 20th century, formalized by mid-century, is that metropolitan areas are statistical areas. It's not that they're spatially expansive, it's that there's common commuting. And the reason they did it is because economists really pushed for the statistic. And what they wanted was common labor markets, they wanted retail areas, housing markets, things that were across a whole metropolis. And the fact is that if you look at economic integration and you have a recession in some part of a region, and it ripples through the rest of the region. So housing markets go up and down. And we've checked this, by the way, at the megapolitan scale. You can see, for example, Phoenix, Tucson go in and out of recessions at the same time. They're close enough to show the integration. Tampa, Orlando. They're close enough to where you see the impact on housing, you see the impact on jobs, on retail trade, and so on. So we've actually developed even a sort of way of getting at the larger scale of that before you're even thoroughly integrated. And part of that is there's all these connections in the country. I mean, I've had to go and do this state economic development plan up in my home state now, Nevada. And it's amazing how dependent the Reno trade in logistics and warehousing is tied to the deepening of the port at Oakland in the Bay Area. And how important that relationship is, because without that deepening of that port, you couldn't take a certain draft ship in. You can't take the spillover from the Port of Los Angeles. There's no value to the transshipment into the Intermountain West that way, and so on. So this is all connected. It's connected in logistics, certainly. It's connected in business travel. It's connected in terms of trade areas. And then it's most intimately connected immediately by commuting. And what's changing with commuting is this. The distance of commuting has grown. And it's not just that we have cars that go faster or we tolerate more traffic. It's that there's some flexibility in employment now, in that some big share of especially high-end white-collar work could be done anywhere. In fact, I wrote a lot of this book in a plane, so if you get you're reading it and you're like, what's going on? I was oxygen deprived, because they don't give you nearly enough up there. And so, I think college faculty were a good, visible front end of this change, because they, of course, everybody, you only have to teach a couple of days a week. My mother still doesn't get that. I told her that since I've been at UNLV, I've been so busy, I taught only one class, and she was appalled. She's like, but you're a teacher. I said, no, I live in virtual space, and so I don't have to be there any one day. I'm here today. I'm not even there right now. As far as she's concerned, I'm away from my job. But the new world is you don't have to go in every day, but you have to go in enough, or you're never going to get to be vice president, because you have to sit and go off your iPhone and say, what's happening with Johnson? That doesn't look so good. No, stay away from him. You need to know that, or you'll never get to be. You can't phone in being VP. So people need to go enough. They don't need to go every day, and it really creates this tremendous flexibility where I know people who just make all-staff meetings, and they're partners in law firms in Los Angeles, and they live in Salt Lake City. There's an article coming out tomorrow in the USA Today, unless there's war in the Mideast again or something like that. And I'm in the article, and it's about this book, and it's the same reporter who did the first article. We had to come up with a whole new way for her to do her work so that the editor didn't pick up on, did we do this thing in 2005? And in it, it's about how the whole IT industry, which is big in Las Vegas because of the casinos, and the fact is it's oddly connected to Houston. It's the heart of the internet. Thank you, Enron, for leaving all that capacity. And mostly its senior management in these firms are coming from Los Angeles, not moving to Las Vegas. They're just flying in every day. They're like, we'd rather fly in than drive to the Inland Empire from Orange County. It's easier to just get into Las Vegas that way. So you see this change. And so I was hesitant to give just the lights. I need to know the function. The lights aren't bad. The lights show environmental impact, for example. The lights show valuable things. All of this is valuable. Every iteration, every look at this is cumulative. And so I'm appreciative of any method that's at this. In fact, the RPA work was great because the focus on logistics and flow is, as a way, just as legitimate as what the census is doing. The reason we were close to the census is the census is tied to federal expenditures. Roads, things that big infrastructure, critical infrastructure. We wanted to make sure that geography lined up with that planners need to make requests, and to plan at that scale, they need to plan at Metropolitan Planning Organization scale, going back to the big airport in Dallas. So we needed that geography as planners specifically. It doesn't mean the other geographies are illegit. They're all legit. They just get at different things, and there's different purposes to them. This is really the geography more of high-speed rail, say. We started with the projection at the county level to 2040. And this is what we got out, and I'll tell you how we did this. First off, the data comes from a firm in D.C. on Connecticut Ave, so if you want to throw rocks at anybody, if you don't like the numbers, I'll tell you what their address is, because I've been there a bunch of times, called Woods and Pool. And a lot of them are ex-census workers. And they take the county geography of the U.S. and project ahead. And they sell it. And they have their own separate algorithms and their own way of doing things. They've been pretty predictive. The census has been kind of cautious with America. Like the census couldn't believe that America just grew in the last 2 decades, 62 million people. That is like adding either France or Great Britain on top of already a large country. Half of that growth was Hispanic. That's the equivalent of Venezuela. That's on top of a lot of Hispanics already in the country. There's more people of Spanish origin in the U.S. than there are in Spain at this point. So that's what kind of growth we've seen. And it still continues. It's not like we've stopped growing. A lot of it is even natural increase at this point, because we have a relatively youthful population for a developing country. We're the only developed country that's on track to add another 100 million people by mid-century. And really only India or Pakistan get there. China doesn't because of the one-child policy. China is about reorganizing the country so that you're urban. And that's the growth, from rural to urban. We went through that in the 1920s. But we're growing with, actual citizens. And it's strange because the U.S. takes on a kind of developing country quality in these kinds of growth rates. And it is a dynamic place. And the worry I have is that we're not even engaged in any of the conversations necessary on either workforce, access to education, and infrastructure investment that would match some of the dynamic nature of the population growth. And so it's a recipe for potential disaster. I don't think it's going to go quite that way. I think we'll begin to see some of the drama of this change and adjust and muddle through. But it's daunting because the numbers are startling. And it's like the Europeans are somehow building all this new infrastructure for who I have no idea. By the middle of this century, Europe is an assisted living facility. And with an angry and mostly unassimilated non-citizen workforce as the caregivers. And the U.S., for all of its warts, is pretty impressive in its capacity to suck in, absorb, assimilate. Our language, too, is not exactly under threat. We were having a conversation earlier today. I speculated that if the U.S. in multiple efforts attempted to take Canada, Oops, sorry about that, Canada. Had it taken Canada, what was the chance that we would have left French-speaking Quebec? Not a chance. It would be like the French Quarter. Isn't this interesting? Don't speak French. Like that. It would be, we're in charge, and it's English. And so, we're not like the French worried about our fragility of our language. We shouldn't be, at least. Even a place that pushed immigration hard 1070, the guy who pushed it got pushed out of office in this last election. And I'm happy to say the weirdest thing happened in relation to that. I did a piece on, I called Phoenix the New Birmingham, and showed that Birmingham lost out to Atlanta. Hartsfield, the mayor, came up with this cool tag on Atlanta: town too busy to hate. Not that we'd like to hate, but we're too busy. So it was a signal to Northerners, like, look, if you're going to do business in the South, don't go to Birmingham. They got dogs and churches, and Dr. King lives here. He's a citizen. He goes there, they put him in jail. And so the leadership in Atlanta knew how to game the Northerners into thinking, Atlanta was some sort of, not paradise, but at least past civil rights. And the same thing is true in Phoenix. I said, you're at risk for, really forfeiting what looks to be a good economic growth. You're in California's business. You're getting Intel plants from the Bay Area. You're getting technology like solar and so on from around the world. These folks are going to just disinvest in you if they see intolerance like this. And, I said, my city, by contrast, just is too greedy to hate. Las Vegas, you'd lose, if you pushed hard on this, you'd lose Mexican Independence Day weekend, which the sales of just booze alone justifies the state's investment in that. And Salt Lake is too pious to hate. It's come up, these are folks that we're so confident, we'll assimilate you and recruit you. So, Denver's too sophisticated. California's post-hate. It's into new things weirder than hate that no one can quite, so you're at risk. And these kinds of issues impact cities' fates. So what we project may or may not come to pass. That Atlanta didn't look any better prospect in 1950 than Birmingham. Birmingham had a better industrial base. But Atlanta built a serious airport. Atlanta had a mayor who is more responsible for that region's growth, not just in the way he was able to work with the federal government and gain key pieces of infrastructure, but the fact that he understood the evolving situation in civil rights and positioned the city smartly. So none of this is written in stone. This is all numbers. Numbers change. No one predicted Las Vegas would be as big as it is. Maybe Las Vegas won't grow again. It's frankly not growing right now. And so it's all speculative. But in planning, you have to make a best faith estimate. So these are the regions by 2040 that have over 4 million residents and have contiguous counties where you can demonstrate commuting. And I'll show you more specifically how that works. Starting with a map like this, which is all these little dots and is the cover of the book, actually, because a grad student did a good job. We produced a series of scenarios. This is who lives in Polk County, and lots of people have been on this, on the I-4 corridor between Tampa and Orlando. And in that corridor, historically, this county here is Polk, Lakeland. Historically, commuting went back to Hillsborough County. But what happened is Orlando built these giant entertainment complexes in Orange County, Florida. Disney, Universal. And so that big blue dot up here is all the people now commuting to that part of southwest Orange County. In time, that growth will suck Polk, not just to Tampa, but all the way into Orlando as well. And when it does, when it reaches that threshold, the census identifies it as a combined statistical area. And I'll show the definition of that in a second. And so we looked around the country. Where do you see this? What you don't see is this city and Dallas never join up. It's too distant. But Austin and San Antonio do, if you take it out to mid-century. And Tampa and Orlando obviously do, and Tucson and Phoenix. If you're about 100 miles apart, 80 miles apart, you're close enough. Already, as I said, Akron is in, at this moment, the census has Akron combined with Cleveland. It has Providence with Boston, as I mentioned, Baltimore, Washington. Further on, it's Baltimore, Washington, Richmond, through a place like Fredericksburg, which is halfway in between and has commuters going both directions, and so on. So you see these link-ups around the country. And what you started with was just an old metropolitan statistical area. 50,000 people in the surrounding counties, 25% of people from any county commuted back into the core. And then in 2003, the census loosened the statistic up a bit and said it's only 15% and you could be seen as in a combined area. And what we have in this sort of megapolitan or super regional level would be, 50 to up to 200 at the extreme limit apart, where you get to 15% by 2040. And finally, you could look at all Florida as having a large urban complex that's related. Like you could have high-speed rail ultimately between, well, you can't even get it between Tampa and Orlando. And oh, by the way, that whole rail was an economic development project. It was an effort, actually, by the leadership of Orlando to diversify Orlando's economy, which is heavily tourist-dependent, into another regional economy that has logistics and a port in Tampa, and to build along the corridor a high-tech belt of especially biotech because of the elderly population in Florida seeming like a good niche. And so there was a very conscious effort, it was very bipartisan, to use that as a hook between both regions. And of course, it was all going to get paid for, and the German firms that were the investors were willing to suck up a lot of cost overruns because they were the last large market without this capacity. And so firms from Europe are looking to do tech transfer to the U.S. and looking to get into the U.S. market. So it's like the way Boeing is, sucking up when they're reaching out to a developing country, covering some of the costs just to stimulate demand for a transportation product. That's the way this was looked at. And so this wasn't really going to cost Tampa and Orlando a nickel. And everybody in elective office there, both parties knew this. They understood this. But a new governor came in. That's what could happen in the U.S. A new governor could say, I'm going to take this piece out. And now there was a lot of pushback. People said, I don't even care if it works. What it is it's the development around the stations. We've got all these plans to do this high density, these medical villages. And all of this would help relieve some congestion on I-4, and it would help tourism in both because you've got Busch Gardens in one, you've got, people could fly into Orlando and do both cities, basically. Forget about it. And, if you go to Euro Disney outside of Paris, there's rail right up to it, so Disney was going to get a station, as it would make sense from the airport. Oh my God, you just whiz over there and you're, boom. And you can go on to Tampa, but that's how it goes. It's politics, folks, and that can, you can get derailed. So in the long range, it's hoped that Orlando could get linked to Miami with something better than just regional aircraft. And these are just the specific kinds of definitions, specific to each type, metro combined. And here are examples, like Dallas and this city and Austin are all together as both metro areas, and they also have combined statistical areas because they pick off these little counties that are kind of half in and not half in. Going forward, really, the only big joining is that San Antonio links up with Austin. And then at the highest level, you've got networks of these bigger regions, like the Texas Triangle. And so this is just a extended version of what that looks like between two cities like a Tampa, Orlando, or Austin, San Antonio, where you have this mid-realm. There's this old theory called urban realm theory, the first detected in Los Angeles. Like, for example, think about Southern California. If you fly to Southern California, the first question you should ask yourself is, where am I going in Southern California? Because where you're going in that region determines which airport you'll pick. John Wayne, Burbank, Long Beach, Los Angeles, Ontario. Because you know that it could take longer to drive across Southern California than to fly there from the East Coast. And each of those areas is connected to a larger regional economy. Like Orange County is within the LA orbit. And it routes for LA sports teams and it uses the big international airport. But it's also a separate space, semi-independent of Los Angeles, where there's some people that never leave Orange County. They're behind the orange curtain, as they say in Los Angeles, disparagingly, not nicely. And yet, you could have a great life in Orange County. You could work, in automotive design at the Hyundai plant or the Hyundai design facility in Irvine, and you could, fly in and out to regional cities in the rest of the U.S. You could get to Chicago, you could get here without having to go through L.A. And so, places like Jamboree Road have risen up as office complexes on the scale of a decent-sized city, bigger than even a city like, say, Nashville, big on a scale, but yet it's still part of greater LA. By extension, you have so much of this spread in these realms, in these semi-independent pieces, that the components are coming together, forming, coalescing, and unifying across that space. And that's why it shows all this kind of ambiguous overlap. It's hard. You need a supercomputer. We had, some of the folks in Virginia Tech run simulations. One of the defense contracts the school had was, what if somebody has smallpox in Portland, Oregon? How much time do you have before the rest of the country has smallpox? and that it simulates exchanges between people at every second in the U.S. based on all the information we have, airport flows, commuter flows, everything. So they crammed all this into the supercomputer. And the first thing is, get out of Seattle. It's coming next. And it goes through a logical series, but it also jumps to cities that Portland connects to and so on. So it's very difficult to sort of put all this together because we've created this enormous space. We commute as we choose. We live where we choose. We try to link it all up, but we'll just stop on 15 trips on the way home and use an automobile to do it. And in the process, we've created this vast complexity that doesn't lend itself to almost any kind of immediate characterization. And so there's ambiguity even shown in the graphic here for that reason. Now this is the cluster we're in at the Texas Triangle. Notice, close, and they even touch in the case of Dallas and Central. But southeast Texas doesn't really get in there. It gets bigger. Counties get added. So that's the total space, and that's the rural continuum. Some of these counties that are now rural have enough commuters at 15% to get in. Yes?
Is this today?
Yeah.
Or is this a projection?
Nope, this is today. This is as it stands at the 2010 census, which is when this was done, right after the census was released and we had the numbers. So this is where you are at the moment. But in the future, the number of counties that are over 1 million, the number of counties that are connected goes up. But anything that's in that space, the space is projected. In other words, the outlines are 2040. The county statuses are current. But the scale of what we think the metros will be under the U.S. official definition is there right now. So, for example, Dallas is in Oklahoma. But we don't think this region reaches Louisiana. It doesn't really get in, based on commuting. There's a break. It doesn't get to New Orleans, for example. But it gets bigger. It's like super version of itself. Super Dallas, too. The Metroplex wasn't big enough. It's practically reaching down I-35 all the way to Austin and San Antonio, but it didn't get there. Because the people living at that edge commute back up, even if they connect and they're contiguous. And this is just the way natural amenities are defined in this resource we had. And you see Texas Hill Country in there. Just some quick looks. Economic dependence, depending on if you've got a cluster, like some of these are heavy government counties, like, for example, the state capital. Others are natural resource based. This city's got manufacturing. We also have maps on this one, logistics and so on, and you see that in refining. What it is here is that there's so much refining, especially east of here, that it's such a dominant cluster that it's considered manufacturing. And this is finally Richard Florida's creative class. Where are the most educated spaces right now? What are the counties where you've got the most workers that are white collar, a third of which are with a possession of a bachelor's degree and so on. And you see the hearts of each region. The periphery is still semi-rural. And Ardmore, Oklahoma is never going to be all the way in Dallas. It's still going to be a distinct place. And it's still going to plan differently even. Keep going. Come on. There we go. This is just a land area. Shows how vast it is in terms of square miles and, acreage and the like. Enormous amounts of land and acres, rather. I think that was in acreage, pardon me. This is the population to 2040. And what's interesting is, again, this had to be adjusted. We had to redo this. That's why I'm the second author, because I didn't want to get stuck doing it. I was too busy. Somebody else had to do this. I said, for that heavy lifting, we'll flip. And you see the numbers are, big, but not astounding given what's happened here. By 30 more years from today, could you imagine, and again, the bigger space. You don't just grow, you pick off more counties. That's what's different. It's not just the growth rate of the existing region. This has already bigger populations at 2010 because we're including more. We're including the space you're going to get. So it's apples to apples across time. It's not one geography to another geography. But a lot of the growth is the pick-off as you go forward. But this is apples to apples in that this includes all the growth in all the counties. And there's multiple counties. And Texas has... How many counties does this state? Why do you have so many counties? Every postage stamp out there is a county. Yeah. So you see the smallest region has the fastest growth, but it doesn't have the most absolute growth. That would be Dallas-Fort Worth. And Dallas-Fort Worth remains the largest large-scale urban complex in the state, just barely ahead of this region. This is the white non-Hispanic population. Now, let me just say something. Hispanics are not a separate race. They are an ethnicity, and this is controversial in the census doesn't really know what to do here. Hispanics are an overlay, so you can be white and Hispanic. In fact, about 54% of Hispanics report being white. About 1/3 of Hispanics say to the census either they don't know or go to hell. That's easy to do to the census. Census has no power. It's not, Germany, where they are checking into what your background is in 1935. So it's voluntary. You are what you say you are in America. You want to say you're of multiple race, report it. If not, pick one. And here you have most Hispanics, again, are saying, the majority say they're white. About 1/3 more won't report. 2/3 of that is estimated to be white if they were to be tagged by the census and put. So about 70% of Hispanics are white, meaning mostly of European origin, but different by language, different by culture. And so the USA Today did this nice story of the white population of the United States is booming, if you include the Hispanics. And you see that here as well. Notice that in this region, you actually lose white population. Now, I'm not saying anything radical here. I think folks have been saying that around here. Dallas still gains white population. Certainly Central Texas, the I-35 corridor, gains population. This region actually loses it, but it keeps growing because the boom in minority population, which is quite substantial. And so the region is strongly majority-minority. But minority means no majority in most cases. And again, by 2050 or 40, Hispanics may not be defined the same way because of intermarriage, because of time. This changes historically in the past. The census used to keep tabs on every white ethnic population. It could tell you how many Italians, Poles, everything. But by the 20th century, mid-20th century, it was out of that business. It couldn't separate people anymore. It's hard to know because what happened is what emerged in the U.S. was a kind of pan-Europeanism, not seen in Europe really. That people from different parts of Europe, from Reykjavik to the Black Sea, to the Caucasus, Caucasian, were part of one widely intermarrying, hard to differentiate population. Early 20th century, there's very firm distinctions between Northwest Europeans, Dutch, German, British, and Southern and Eastern Europeans, Polish, Greek, Italian. And in 1924, after allowing wave upon wave of immigration to the U.S., and the biggest years, even bigger than the years we see now, 1910, 1912, and as a percentage of the country, it's enormous. The foreign-born share of the U.S. is tremendous in those years. The U.S. limits immigration. Today, the vast share of the Supreme Court appointees are all out of this same white ethnic background. In fact, there's 4 of the 5 boroughs of New York represented on the Supreme Court currently, and mostly Jewish and Italian and Catholic background and Hispanic. And so the very population that was limited from, from entering the U.S. in big numbers post-1924 until we liberalized immigration again in 1965, and then no Italians wanted to come. They had their own project, building post-war Italy, say. They weren't interested in immigrating to the New World. So the populations that did come are mostly Latino and Asian post that date. And the numbers are reflected here. We also have a high natural rate of increase because when you get to the U.S., you still reflect the sending country's pattern of family size. And it quickly changes. By your children, they're like, wait a minute. Well, why were there 6 of us? I'm not doing that. Chances are also this is one of the most rapidly assimilating nations in rates that look at what share speak after being foreign-born or born in the U.S. of foreign-born parents, but language dominant at home is non-English. What share by college age are speaking almost exclusively the language? It's tremendous. You look at the numbers in Europe; it's hard to believe the difference. There are parts of Europe because Europe defines its identity on blood, not on soil. It has no 14th Amendment. It has no enfranchisement due to just birth. And as a result, there are colonies of immigrants that can go several generations in Europe without assimilating. Very large regions in the U.S. produce such institutional completeness in ethnic experience, like Koreatown in L.A., that you can go a couple of generations and get away with not learning English. But if you move to most of America, including most metropolitan America, you're going to probably find a pretty high demand, pretty high premium placed, a value placed, an economic opportunity and education value placed on quick acquisition of English. And so, a place like, for example, Dallas, outside of Texas Stadium, when I was a kid, I was growing up in New York, you might detect the accent, and the Dallas Cowboys would humiliate continuously the New York Giants, which was one of my pet peeves as a kid. I couldn't believe, why we sucked so badly. And, and I would see, they'd show Texas Stadium on television, And at first I was in Dallas, I was with my dad who leased large equipment, as a business. And I'm like, I don't want to go there. That's the heart of darkness. He's like, because of football? I'm like, yeah, because of Roger Staubach. I don't want to go. It's like, yeah, it's all one big country, kid. You could live there someday. Trust me. So I remember going and seeing these neighborhoods in 1971, 1972. My God. Now the marquees are all in different languages. It's amazing the transformation in a state like this. It's not New York and LA and Chicago. It's everywhere above 1 million people in the United States, and even below 1 million people, that you see that kind of change. And so, suddenly there's a convergence. In fact, Dallas had the experience of losing the most exclusively white neighborhoods the fastest in the 1990 to 2000 census, as analyzed by the Brookings Institution. It just dropped like a crater. It was defined as 95% non-Hispanic white neighborhoods at the block level. And when you looked 10 years later, they were at 91%. They were at 88%. You could see already diversity penetrate. And it's like the early 20th century. There was a time where most Hispanics, let's say Italians or Jews, Poles, Russians lived in, Manhattan. By 1950, they're in Levittown. They're living the suburban dream. And they're interchangeable with native-born whites. Part of that is that we stemmed immigration, too. And so you had 2 or 3 decades of all assimilation without any reinforcement of any of those colonies of ethnic identity. This is employment. By the way, these are all jobs meaning multiple jobs. A lot of people have more than one job, it turns out. Even consulting. Things like that. I think I might have 4 or 5 jobs. I have 5 titles or something like that. So I would have 2. And so if it seems like, wow, there's a lot of jobs there, it's the total amount of employment based on reporting even through the IRS, meaning you can identify a home business, and when you add it up, Americans, and there are some regions, this is wild. Europeans don't even know what 1099 employment is. They're still trying to figure that out. And you look at a region like LA and the share of people that are consultants in LA, it doesn't look like there's any employment in LA except for consultancy. And it's all like deal making or something. This is just a metric I threw in to show we had a lot of environmental data. We have greenhouse gas, by the way. This region could work on that, incidentally. And part of that is that you're belching it because of manufacturing and refining distillates for the rest of the country. So that's not fair. Part of this is that you're doing export of an energy product, and the energy product is kind of dirty as you manufacture it, and then we get to burn it in the rest of the country, and we're not tagged with that as far as non-attainment. But this is water, and you can see most regions are actually reducing consumption over the last 15 years, but Dallas has gone off on some strange water jag. What is going on in Dallas? I'm theorizing master plan community development that's water intensive or something like that. And I see a lot of fountains in that city. There's some sort of water celebratory culture, more so than even Las Vegas. They should have the fountains at the Bellagio. But the rest of the country is dropping, and the Texas Triangle's numbers would look better, but you've got Dallas in there. And by the way, that's true of a lot of metrics on this stuff. Dallas kind of is off on some alternate universe in a way. And is driving high VMT, is, really out there. Residential development, this shows the units recycled, the increase in inventory. This is all projection based on the units come out at about 110 years of cycle. The residential real estate endures the longest. The shortest is big box retail. 15 years later, it's all new big box retail. It all cycles out. So the numbers are startling on that. But you can even see in residences, it's a tremendous amount. This projects family size, everything. We have all this formula in there. This is why the real estate industry guys like us. We have all this formula that projects construction demand, residential demand, and categories of commercial real estate. Office space goes a little longer, but certain forms of retail turn over overnight. And in fact, the interesting thing is even in this recession, necessity retail, which is like a Walgreens, they've still been building them at the rate of increase of the U.S. population. So the companies that do that, and I work with one, Coal Capital, out of Phoenix, these guys are booming. Because with population growth, you just need X number of Walgreens. And it's very formula driven, and it's it's necessary consumption. It's drugs, it's milk and things like that. These are, now I want to talk about the connections of this region into the global economy. These are the connections that all major cities have, and the red here means that you're both an international and domestic hub. And what's good about this space is that it is very linked up to the world. The triangle, except for, of course, Austin and San Antonio. A really strongly linked region is the Southwest, in that Sky Harbor, LAX, and McCarran are really strong airports, all of them globally reaching. And not quite the way LAX is globally reaching. But the two airports, Bush and DFW, are solid major hub airports, and they're international airports. And so what that means is that if businesses seek American access, this is it. This is how you get in. Also, this region has a serious port. This region reminds me, in some ways, of the Southwest, which is a bookend. Because LA is the port, you've got two inland cities that are, aircraft dependent, air cargo dependent. The same thing happens here. And then, there's going to be a lot of transshipment from Mexico, actually, through Phoenix and Las Vegas. The only place in the interstate system without a direct link between two large multi-million person cities is the missing, called it Interstate 11. That's how I refer to it to the Nevada delegation, as we ask continuously for the satisfaction of that particular road from the federal government. The federal government built the interstate system based on the 1950 geography. If you had 50,000 people in 50, you're in. Lubbock, San Antonio, in. There's an interstate. Las Vegas, too small, so it doesn't directly connect. And the brilliance of the federal government is such where, sorry, you weren't there in 50. The whole world, what's changed since 50? Every baseball team was between St. Louis, D.C., and Boston in 1950. Want to talk about where their geography is now? Everything's changed since 1950, except the census's formula for establishing the interstate system. So, fortunately, you're all linked up. You were the right scale. You have the right, you don't have the width of road, the kind of scale of infrastructure, but, the airport investments. You got the federal government, you clipped them for the right amount of stuff at the right time. This state has never been shy. I know it talks a good libertarian game about not wanting government. You got a lot of famous governors talk about government, things like that. I don't think I'm doing justice to these accents, by the way. But when, push comes to shove, the citizens in Nevada are like, yeah, and we mean it. We don't want it. We don't even need Interstate 11. We could build it ourselves. Hoover Dam was built by a bunch of farmers. No, it was not, by the way. But here, you talk a good game, but when it's time, we're a big state. We got a lot of people in Congress. Turn it over. We'll use it. We'll build a big old highway. And so big old airports, big old connect, scale, reach, impressive. This is the World City Air Network. What happened there was a Belgian airline that was the national airline of Belgium that went out of business because high-speed rail killed it from Paris. So before they went out of business, they dumped all this data on my friends in Europe, my little École Normale superior friends there, who forgive me for not speaking French. I am monolinguistic and challenged in the one language that I have been assimilated into. And what this map is that they were able to do, this is males traveling alone, and they exit the airport. In other words, they leave the airport. They don't just go through Atlanta to another city. So Atlanta looks very impressive when you look at numbers. When you look at who actually gets out of the airport, it's not as impressive. And so these little circles are the numbers, exits, and then these are the strengths of connectivity. And you see, like Hong Kong and Bangkok and Tokyo and all these connections. Taipei is not shown in here, but is also one of the connectors later on when we did this and reran the data. You see both cities in Texas that are major airports are in there. and linked to the U.S. network most specifically. And you see even Las Vegas is in there with that heavy connect to Los Angeles, and the transcontinental stuff, and New York and London are in there. So what this shows was actually mail traveling alone, exit airport business travel. This is the global network of who goes where, and mails alone were a proxy for business. Now the interesting thing too is that Las Vegas came up high, and these researchers almost threw it out because they said, who's going there on business? I'm like, conventions. Oh, right. It's a business destination in the middle of the week. On the weekend, it's a celebration of adult freedom. During the weekday, it is one of the most serious cities I've ever seen because there's all these like tech conventions in town, and you just drop in on any hotel, you pass a door between, two tables, and out comes, hieroglyphics. It's so complex. And it's a business. Orlando almost made this scaling because of business travel. But this means that these cities, there's two representations within this global network, within this space, in this state. And that is a pretty high share. You almost get to an Atlanta scale or a DC scale in terms of that connectivity. Even Phoenix doesn't get into this scaling. It doesn't have that kind of business travel. It does because it doesn't have the advantage Las Vegas had in this, which is international travel to Las Vegas on increasingly international conventions.
When was that done?
This was done in '05. That's when they went out of business. Thank you. We've never gotten updated data. The data was $1 million. And it was, you had to participate in this whole consortium that does all this stuff. And they only trusted one person with it, Ben Druder. That's who the guy that did this, and he's in Ghent. We went to a conference in Ghent, and I had to explain anomalies. That's what we all participated in. We came in, and I had to explain the Las Vegas anomaly. They were like, there's no purpose to Las Vegas. I'm like, it's not bachelor party weekends. It's not the hangover. There's actual business travel to the city. It's just that it's an ad hoc market exchange where face-to-face deals are done and then followed up with new technology. But it's business, and so put it in. And this is before I was a local booster. I lived in Virginia when I was making that case. This is the air routes that are foreign out of DFW as of last year. It was 10, early 10 this is from. So if there's routes added or subtracted, let me know. But you see, and I show this as well for this region, the Seoul-Tokyo connects, not that well connected to Canada as these kinds of regions go, but Latin American heavy, very heavy, and even connected to Europe. And this is just a different kind of way to look at it. The Wikipedia, this is January 11, does these nice little maps where each dot is a nonstop. So you see a lot of nonstops. Look at the way Bush Airport is connected to Mexico and Central America. It's stunning. And you can even see down here, they blow it up. All kinds of Latin American, European, and even Middle East connects. Energy. Wherever there's a derrick, there is a connection from this city. Because it reflects demand. It reflects its business travel. And this is the reach from this state of the new technology of a Boeing 787. One of the problems with being in the central location in this country is that access to both the Asian and European markets have been buffered by coasts, LAX, Atlanta. And so it has diminished some of the connectivity that this region could have made, but the technology is always changing. And what's different is that a 787 is a super light aircraft. It gets much more mileage for the gas you put in it. So there's not, there's all these safety margins if you fly to, Australia. Now the first 787 flight in the U.S. is going to be from here to Auckland, New Zealand, nonstop. And what's good about this, these planes are slightly smaller than a typical wide body. They're more flexible. They require less passengers to make them work. And so what's going to happen, the theory goes, and there's an A350 version of this Airbus is developing that's about 3-4 years behind Boeing. When these become the common transoceanic aircraft in the next 15 or 20 years, it's going to open up an entire new tier of city-to-city connect around some of the dominant hubs like an LAX or an Atlanta, and have a region like this reach all of the world. There's no more worry that we've used up too much fuel on the way to Australia and we have to stop in Fiji because we came from Dallas. It's, don't worry, this aircraft's light, and it's got more range, and it's got the right amount of passengers. And maybe we're not going to Sydney, maybe we're going to Melbourne, maybe we're going to Perth. Look at what you can reach from that. That's the safe limit, fully loaded, fully passengered estimation of, from this state, a 787. And it means that within a generation, virtually all the world is within nonstop air service. And then the competition isn't about, where you need to go by hub or by safety. It's where you want to go by business. And so I expect this is an advantage to a central location in the U.S. Yes?
Question, just I'm not sure if I'm seeing this right. Can you get to India base?
Yeah.
Okay, that's all right.
Everything except the bottom,
Okay,
yeah.
circle. Okay.
Wherever that circle is. So, and a lot of Antarctica is reachable, apparently. Wherever that circle is. So this side of the world's favored, and that's why if it's a further tip of the subcontinent, it's a little further away. Yes?
I have a question. It's not related, but I'm very proud. And I'm thinking, am I going to check my luggage if not carry it on?
Haven't you seen those bins?
I'm going to need access.
The bins in the new 787s? You could put you could bring along a refrigerator and some, gapping tape and shove it up into the overhead bins. They got it. What's happened is, Boeing moved its headquarters from Seattle to Chicago. The reason they did it is they wanted to channel. Detroit should have done this, by the way. Detroit should have moved all design and everything to Irvine, California. Californians won't buy what Midwesterners make, but Midwesterners will buy what Californians design. That's the truth. And Boeing got smart and said, look, we're in a relatively small city. It's not that globally reaching. Let's get to a great city like Chicago, to O'Hare, and figure out business travel. What do they want? They want what you want. Can I roll my damn big bag in and it's going to fit? Do I have to go through LAX? I love you. I'm going to keep buying more Boeing aircraft. That's what you'll tell the airlines in surveys. So they figured this out. They put it together. And part of that is, again, the reframing. And Dallas almost got Boeing. It was the last competitor city against Chicago. And everybody couldn't believe Chicago. Chicago's dying. No, it's not. It's not dying at all. It's the great city of the Midwest. It's the last city of the Midwest. If there's one last city standing in the Midwest, it's certainly Chicago. It's not the city of the big shoulders anymore. It's full of accounting firms. I call it the city of the big ledger books now. It's moved on. It still has the wicked women next to the lamp or whatever else is in that poem. But yeah, this is a real advantage. And by the way, the city I'm in, they pray to the idol that is the 787. The airport guys, we're about to complete an international terminal that can process people second after LAX in Las Vegas. And all bets are on. Just please not have you go to California and lose your money at Disney before you show up with us. That's the beef. Why are you renting the cars out of there? Why are you paying concession price? Just fly to us. We'll hook you up. Maybe you'll visit Southern California later, or probably won't after we're done with you, as we cross-sell you a million things. So we're, in my city, loving this. And we're in a family of cities not unlike this one, which is just below the tier of the sort of massive global connect. And a few have moved up the scale. Some cities have been very aggressive about this. And by the way, where planes go and don't go means everything. Now, this is a fortunate city. Here's why. You just went through a merger. Your firm was absorbed by some firm based in another city. But they'll never eliminate this hub. You know who's going to get it? Cleveland. Just like Pittsburgh got it and St. Louis got it. When Pittsburgh got it, I have to go to Pittsburgh. I think I have to change plane. It's like I'm going to Allegheny or something like that. I'm going to Erie, Pennsylvania. It might as well be the way I have to change planes to get to this place. Some cities are falling out of the global connect. Kansas City, St. Louis, they're in the same state, Missouri. Missouri has no nonstop flights as a state that you can just step on a plane and fly across an ocean. Think about what this state has. Yeah, TWA, everything's gone, And they lost in this. And this round, the two cities on the line are Denver and Cleveland. And here's what Denver did. Remember old Stapleton Airport? They had this air facility left there. They fixed it up and handed the keys to United. It's on the house. Please don't end our role as a world city. Because you could. And Pittsburgh, and it's a shame, Pittsburgh is a city that went through a terrible deindustrialization from, steel mills, and by the way, still exports the producer services of how to build a steel plant. They don't have any, but they know how to build them. So do their universities. And they really positioned themselves nicely. They substituted banking and now, after all that, U.S. Airways walks away from them. U.S. Airways, ironically, left Las Vegas. They couldn't fill the slots fast enough. They were like, good. We didn't want a hub. You weren't getting out and spending money. You were on your way to grandma's house in Fresno. Please leave our airport. We want planes that land and get out, just like you saw in that graphic. But Pittsburgh has never been heard from again. Pittsburgh is lost now. And there's cities like Charlotte emerging that are capturing a lot of trade. U.S. Airways' eastern branch is really there, and Philadelphia, and more favored lately, it seems, in Charlotte. Banking, it's connected to Zurich, it's connected to Frankfurt and all these sort of financial centers in London. And so some are coming up and some are going down. The good news here is there's so much scale in this state, in these regions, you'll never come out. You're insulated. You can't come out. It's too big. There's too many people that need to get to Caracas from here and are willing to pay business class to do so. The beef we get is nobody wants to go in the front of the planes to Las Vegas. If it wasn't for the convention trade, we'd be finished, but we've got enough to show that. But here, apparently a lot of people go in the front of the plane up here. And they're rich enough because they're in this nice sector like energy to pay for it. And good for you. Because of that, it means you'll not lose these connections. Because of tourism, my city won't lose connections. But a Pittsburgh, and look at Cleveland. That's all they had left. That Hopkins Airport, the Connect. And you just know, whenever these mergers happen, somebody gets it. What are they merging for? To add costs? Oh, no. They're dropping a hub. And you'll never get dropped. And in fact, if anything, you'll increase the reach. I want to talk for a second about this slide, and then I'm going to wrap up and go to Q&A. In 2005, Peter Taylor from Loughborough, they really care about geography in the UK. He's in this Midlands University. And it's like the only jock school, apparently, in all of Britain. It's all the Olympic training. Jock schools in Britain are different than, Texas A&M, say. Just any A&M folks out there? I'm sure. There you go. That's it. I'm sure the A&M Aggies could roll over Loughborough. Peter Taylor and I ran this analysis that looked at, and this is the connections of firms that are in and have a branch office in Asia, Europe, and the US, and their size of the branch and their connection. And it was in fields like insurance, legal services, media, management consulting, accounting. You get insurance, financial services of various stripes. These were the global firms. And what happened is in that New York and London, this is the US list, New York is not 1.0. London was heavier in Connect than New York. So it was the amount of integration you had into and energy was not in here. And government service wasn't in here. Energy was too specialized. It wasn't broad enough. And there's not that many energy cities as there are insurance cities or financial services cities. You're the energy city. So take note of that. I think it would bump this city into 4th or 5th place. But it was interesting. Latin banking made Miami that connected. And Atlanta is even ahead of Washington, D.C., because that's not what D.C. is doing. It's doing technology. It's doing government. It's doing, it's got a built-in economy, believe me. They take money from the rest of the country and spend it locally. So it doesn't come up as high as in Atlanta. That's the quirk of this thing. Now, the two cities here in this state were almost even Steven. They were dead on, and they were decently ahead of Seattle and not really far behind Boston in a pack. And again, Boston's a solid world city. It's not the leader of the pack, but it's a solid world city. And I think, again, that really reflects where Dallas is more completely than here. And, we wanted to do this for energy at one point. We were even trying to ask you, what was the second city of energy? I remember that. Like after this city, what's number 2? And it's hard to answer. Probably Dubai. I'd guess it goes to the Middle East. I think it goes to the producing nations. And that what it is this city has such a legacy in that sector and has so much intellectual capital to export in that sector that it dominates this global trade in this very key commodity. In fact, the most essential commodity. And that's its whole position. That plus the port, good deal of medical research, aerospace, because of the Johnson Space Flight Center and all that, has built a very diversified, very resilient metropolis. It wasn't always so, think of the S&L crisis. Think of the overbuilding in the 80s, when they would greenlight every project. That happened to me in my city in the last round. They'd greenlight anything. And, somebody's always doing that. Your decade was years earlier, and Texas has built appropriate amount of real estate. I think part of that is even the legacy of the experience in this city from that, enough of the banking community remained to not over-leverage, oversell, overbuild. You saw the production numbers. They matched appropriately population growth. The only city I've seen do it twice is Phoenix. They're the only ones that were sort of really well represented in the first round of the S&L overbuild. They learned nothing. Phoenix never learns. It's all listen, everybody wants to move here. We got some really nice guys. Have you seen the golf courses? Everybody's coming. Get out of their way. They're coming off the ramp right now. This state, these regions have been a little more, you know what, we've been down that road. And maybe you shouldn't do this project. And it's helped tremendously because you didn't have a boom and bust. You didn't oversupply, undersupply, and people weren't heavily leveraged in it. And so the consumers in this region are not underwater. They're, in whatever assets they have, they held mostly. Everybody took a ding in the 08-09 downturn, but, more so than in most of the rest of the country. And there's some other regions like that as well, and some in the Midwest that just never boomed and bust. It turns out there's not a lot of people underwater in Buffalo because they never had anything happening. No one would ever lend you any money for the real estate. So Brookings every quarter produces what's called the Metropolitan Monitor, the Metro Monitor, and it tracks quarter by quarter where you are against your first quarter. And some of the better performing places they weren't booming. So they didn't bust. So, what turns up to be pretty good in that is a Buffalo. It turns up great here. You're in the top 20 or 25%, depending on how we make the metric work. Sometimes you're in the top 2, sometimes the top 10 cities are all out of this state. But it's also that it was growing fast, so it's especially impressive. And then the coasts, especially West Coast, Southwest, Phoenix, Las Vegas, off a cliff. Orlando, Southwest Florida, off a cliff. And then, some parts of the Northeast, like a Boston, fine. So the resilience and the complexity of the whole state's economy and the different parts here relate in that there is a tremendous amount of exchange and business travel between these components. They're in the same state government. They have the same unified systems of, say, higher ed and investment. There's some deficits. For example, this city now has 2, I learned today, schools that are in the top tier of the Carnegie rankings, which is the research rankings. That is I come from a state at 2.7 million. There's not one school. Kansas has 2. They got the same population. But Dallas does not have 1. And the risk is that given the way innovation and technology, and the fact is that the U.S. has been living on some borrowed time, we have overconsumed. We have lived off the legacy of the post-war years, where we dominated the global economy, we made good investments in infrastructure, we built capacity ahead of other countries, we gained technologies ahead of other countries. And the last 30 years, is, even 20 years, say, has been the sort of management of the post-Cold War economy. And we're sort of at the end of the cycle. And the U.S. is going to have to manufacture and export. This region is a strong exporter. This region makes stuff the rest of the world buys and wants, and makes stuff for the rest of the country and sends it there, and especially is important in energy production. But there are consumer cities in this country. And there's some unexpected things. Like the city I'm in doesn't make anything, but everybody wants its product from abroad. So they come and they spend money, and they take their currency, and they change it into dollars, and it goes into the current accounts as an export. And it's it's the strongest service exporter as a share of gross metropolitan product. And then we got firms in other parts of the world where people like our hotels, and 40% of the take in Macau at $40 billion a year goes to the Las Vegas casinos, and they send profits back to the United States, and it's scored as a repatriation of cash and an export, as a service export. So, it's funny, kind of ironic, that what looks to be a parasitic city, it is nonetheless sharing this parasitic nature with the rest of the world. and thus in a global sense, can justify its existence. Whereas some of these, San Francisco's an exporter. There's other, Peoria, the best city for exports, Peoria, Illinois. It's Caterpillar and 100,000 people. Everything they make gets out, goes on a train and gets to a port and goes away. Peoria, Arizona, which is now bigger than Peoria, Illinois, not so much. It's all subdivisions. It's all just a suburb of Phoenix. So things are changing, and the good news here is the scale, the reach, and I think, as a final slide, the sort of cosmopolitan nature of this region. Going back to what I said, and I'll wrap up here, Arizona came pretty close to pushing pretty hard on this. And, the fact is that some of the leadership in that state approached the governor and said, look, we're Intel retirees, and we've been investing in this state all along. This is probably not the way to go. And as I said, in Utah, they came up with a formula, a compact, if you will, that says if you're gainfully employed in the U.S., you're actively participating. They're going to look the other way about point of origin, basically. If you're breaking the law, and out you go. And so I know, and famously in this state, the governor got behind the notion of educating someone whose parents, let them know at age 16 when they asked for a driver's license. Oh, yes, about that license. Your birth certificate's going to say Mexico City. Yeah, sorry about that. There are children in this country who are unaware until the time they reach adulthood or near adulthood and ask for the official use of a birth certificate in order to obtain a license, that are first apprised of the fact that at 2 years old, they were brought to the U.S. when their parents had been just casually telling them, yes, you were born in L.A. Yes, L.A., Mexico, not L.A. here. And so, this is a public policy question, as far as what are you going to do? Now, interestingly, I thought this took some guts. Your governor stepped up and said, you're heartless if you don't. But really what it is in terms of economy, if you want a workforce that's going to be competitive against other workforces, anybody who looks like they're willing to do the work at a university isn't a subsidy. It's that they're building human capital in themselves, gaining skills that are exportable, gaining skills that are competitive, and they're partners with you. You're investing and subsidizing access to that resource, and they're learning and gaining skills against, and improving their own capacity. And so, the country is working this out in different ways. And, you see the map shows like states that are about to go for, Arizona's bill. And it turns out Alabama went for it strong. And so now my new theory is that the new Alabama is actually Alabama. And no one picks their ag products anymore. And, they had this, I'll close on this note. This was an interesting revelation I had. So I'm up there doing the whole regional economy up in northern Nevada. And I meet with all the logistics guys. These nice guys. They're all in golf shirts. They seem like a fun bunch. I'd like to go golfing with them sometime. They're all white. They're all male. They're all about my age or slightly older. And I get into a discussion about, this looks like a really good thing for Reno to be doing, because Reno's dead in the water. And, I say, so who's your competitor? They're like, well, he just lost to Phoenix, Dick's Sporting Goods. And it was a big loss for logistics. A lot of jobs. I said, how'd you lose to him? I'm like, let me speculate. I-10 and workforce. Really? Work ethic. Phoenix? Really? It's like 5 o'clock rolls around in Phoenix and it's cerveza. It's like kick back and get a beer. No. They have a really large immigrant workforce. Recent immigrant workforce. Like maybe not legally here workforce. And have you ever worked in a warehouse? I'm like, I thought about that. Then I decided to work in fast food instead. They were like, I said, no, actually, I caddied. That was my own personal form of torture. Which, that's like a rich kid form of torture. Drunk doctors on a Wednesday afternoon loading you up with booze illegally and then money. Not in a warehouse. Because, I was, I looked like you when I was younger. I was a kid with a golf shirt on. So, and they're like, well, Phoenix has that, and here's our workforce. Native-born whites. I'm like, they don't dig the whole warehouse scene, huh? No, not at all. They turn over immediately. like one day in the warehouse. I'm like, really? And then he turned to me and said, look, Las Vegas doesn't want to get into this, does it? Because you got the same damn workforce. All those people clean the hotels. This probably be an upgrade. I'm like, oh yeah, no, we have that same workforce. That's true. And the interesting thing is that's so different than the public discussion. You know, I'm guessing that the vast majority of these people's politics were probably towards exclusion, yet they understood that Phoenix's capacity was enhanced greatly in their particular sector by a very high energy, let's say, immigrant workforce who, in exchange for access to the country, in a developed country like the U.S., put in a little extra effort because their frame of reference is a developing country. And hardships and deprivation, not because I didn't get the latest iPhone upgrade, but because there's not clean drinking water, which is an actual deprivation. So, you know, I'll leave you on the note to say, Texas, despite all the warts, it's not you know, the Garden of Eden, nor was Atlanta in 1964 when Hartsfield was hustling some sort of scam on the Northerners. But he meant it. It was a town too busy to hate in a way. It's a great mecca today. There's been a lot of returns of African Americans who immigrated to the Northeast, returning to Charlotte and Atlanta, moving to the suburbs, living the good life, enjoying a culture they were familiar with and family and extended family, and feeling comfortable in those regions. And that's a big change in America, and that's a positive change. I think Texas has some of that quality. I think what happened with your governor is he reflected how far along Texas is in understanding this change. And so he was off the reservation with, you know, somebody could come from Iowa and go crazy on this. Yeah, I'm from Iowa. You know, keep them all. You know, well, that's easy from Iowa. What am I to do as governor of Texas? We're in partnership with Mexico on, let me count the number of ways. And immediately, by the way, you know, when Arizona did that, I reached out to my state government. I'm like, you know, why don't we just reach around Arizona? And, you know, I'm going to encourage them to fix this, but let's say they don't. Because the jury's out at that point. The jury's in now, by the way. You know, the jury's in firmly. The guy, Jerry Lewis, who beat him, wrote me when I did the editorial in the Arizona Republic. Arizona Republic's still mad at me for this editorial, saying they're the new Birmingham. No one wants to be the new Birmingham, apparently, except Birmingham. And then, you know, they recognize that this is not the way to go. The interesting thing is that was a heavily Mormon district in Mesa, and the mayor of Mesa, who's Mormon, is progressive in this regard, and it didn't reflect, you know, sort of the district even. It was not fully representative of this expansive view of the Church of Latter-day Saints, which is we're all a big human family, and all these folks are, you know, welcome if they participate and they play by the rules. And that's interesting because that's, in the West, an expansive element to the global outreach. In Texas, I think it's just that this was once obviously part of another country. It was its own country. And it's always been a kind of border space that understood this complexity, and that this city understood that its industry was global at a pretty early point. For a modest-sized regional city in the mid-20th century, having a sector like energy made this city either grow up or get out. And it grew up. And the benefit is that it's redounded to generations, you know, in the future, who are now well employed in what is the command and control center of this well-compensated and critical industry in the global economy. And by contrast, Birmingham has never been heard from again. It shows up in, you know, songs by Leonard Skinner and things like that. But, you know, it's not Atlanta. And Atlanta's management of that diversity entitled it, in a sense, to World City status. So the message here is, the positive note I'll end on is, I don't think this is at any risk, or, you know, you don't see, even though that this state flirted a little with maybe, it got not a likely, I don't think this is going anywhere. So with that, I thank you, and I'll take some questions on this. Questions? Comments? Yes?
You talked a lot about demographics and population. What about the capital changes, like the Eurozone and Mexico's issues bringing capital here? So we've got a lot of foreign investors in Texas. How do we count that?
Oh, those clever Germans. You know, imagine if there was a Deutschmark, what it would cost to buy a Mercedes-Benz, and you didn't have Greece in the same currency. They can bail out these countries. That was their strategy. They recognized that, Northwest Europe realized that it was going after high-end manufacturing. And, a BMW worker makes twice what a Ford worker makes. And the whole welfare state they run in Europe. So they had to get smart about currency. And in the process, even though a lot of economists warned them that, sure, there's compatibilities in currency with places like the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Germany. Yeah, I get it. Greece, Italy, Spain. So what you have, of course, is you have unified currency without unified government. Like, for example, there was a point where, let's say, Massachusetts was massively more affluent, productive than Mississippi. But we'll never know what the exchanges were between the two. Because they were in a single unified, not just currency, but government. So they didn't run trade deficits that went into their bottom line in their budgets. And that's what you've got. What else are the Greeks going to pay the Germans back with? They don't make anything the Germans want to buy. They don't make much of anything, actually. They hang around all day and drink coffee. I've been there. It's a nice country. If you want to hang around and drink coffee. The Germans are massively productive. They sit around all day and I bet, they found out that we have a podium with a coffee holder. And right now in Stuttgart, somebody's examining this from a camera, figuring out we need podiums with, that's what the Americans want. Figuring us out, or Asian manufacturers knowing every car choice we want. So the problem is, and the risk of the exit of some of these countries from the currency is massively disruptive to the global economy. Let's just say, to be on the polite side. But drachma and liras, they're possible. I think the Germans have admitted as much. But again, in one of the debates they were asking, do you think that we should bail out the Italians? No. The Germans should. The reason is they would have a Deutschmark. Do you know how strong that currency would be? Like if it floated and you looked at true current account exchange and you looked and scored exports and imports to that country, it would be through the roof. A Mercedes-Benz would be 40% more probably. So they've played a game. It was a dangerous game. They've sucked, and we did it to them. We got them in the last recession. We got them at the start of this game. It was us selling worthless securities around the world. The exchange, the fair trade was the Germans, and especially I guess China sold us poison toys. Thomas, that was sort of a little jarring for the young ones. Don't lick the Thomas, son. You don't know where that's been. And in exchange, we sold, them poison securities. And that's fair trade. That's what it's about. We are poisoning one another, but our poisoning is different.
What are your thoughts on high-speed rail in this Texas Triangle? And, what kind of a driver would that be? A lot of your look is global. This would kind of strengthen that.
Yeah, I don't want to step in this at this point. It seems that every other nation is capable of delivering multi-types of infrastructure, and especially the idea is to substitute short-haul aircraft for a more efficient ground-based and easier accessible transportation alternative. And so Asia's rushing towards this, Europe's been rushing towards this. The U.S. actually has very fine freight rail. A little known fact, we didn't let our freight rail systems go to seed. We actually maintained them. Warren Buffett, a big owner, some of this big chunk of freight rail. But on passenger rail, we built the interstates, and that was the decision. And then we were effective at developing whole generations of short-haul aircraft. And so the issue is where do you apply this? Every one of these has to be subject to a cost-benefit analysis, and the costs have to include everything, and the benefits have to include everything, including, how much less impact is this on the environment, how much more fuel efficient is this, how many alternative energy sources can you use. I'd like to save, combustion and fossil fuels for transoceanic flight. I don't want to fly across the ocean in an electric plane. But an electric train to Dallas, I can handle it. I've been on them. They don't freak me out. Because they're on the ground. If they run out of juice, it just slows down. It doesn't crash. And so I've seen the T proposal, obviously not all of this would get serviced. But you could do regional rail easily. And I know that there's some of this talk and development from Austin to San Antonio. And you see the whole Front Range of the Wasatch is in that same structure. The Megapolitan rail is riskier than the intra-megapolitan rail because there's so much commuter demand. No one doesn't see the Front Range, the Rockies, and so on as having a natural space. So it's more difficult to argue people are, just get on the plane. So I think you'll see a generation of advanced and further reaching intra-megapolitan rail. You see it on the Front Range of the Wasatch already. You see it between, even smaller cities like, for example, Albuquerque's linked to Santa Fe that way, and so on. Before I think that, we took a shot at high-speed rail, and then the California version of this, I don't think they could ever do anything again. They'd have to all sit around and drink coffee like the Greeks and figure out why they can't do it, because that's what they're doing right now.
Houston, Dallas, corridor.
It would seem, one of the justification points is this. You look at city-to-city pairings and exchange, and RPA, Regional Plan Association, did a great job on this. Put out this nice report. I've used it a million times. It's been in talks I've given. I've thanked them for doing it. Smart stuff. It was a nice analytic way to organize, to look at loads. Brookings has a version of it as well. The problem is, some of this is it suburban city to suburban city? Or is it high density core to high density core? Like the Northeast Corridor line works so well because it takes you to the part of Washington you felt like getting to, or Boston or New York. There's value in being dropped off immediately in those congested spaces. It depends on the evolution of these cities. If these cities intensify and create many dense nodes through infill, through scale, through walkability, through a space, ironically, look at a rail like Las Vegas, LA. Now I get clipped on every day. Somebody's asking me about this thing. When you get to Las Vegas, it's actually a very small space that you're in as a hotel zone, and it's cab friendly. So you kind of don't want to be with a car in Las Vegas. You get a car in Las Vegas, you're going to wind up like those hangover guys, or you're going to get a DUI or something like that. You're like, forget the car. And so there is a there. There's a high density place where there is a privileged space that you'd like to be in, and that if you can get around that space without, and it's not that you're even taking, when you get to a place like Las Vegas, it's all cabs, it's not even transit, but there's a publicly available access. You don't have to hail a cab. You step in front of every hotel. There's lines of them all over the place. I've never seen so many cabs. I saw the statistic out of the airport was, last month there was 344,344 cab originations from McCarran Airport. I didn't even think there were that many cabs in the world, let alone out of one airport in 1 month. So that's a there. I could see it. I could justify it. It's harder. Chicago, I could justify. San Francisco is a there. These cities are getting there. And then there's places where, does it work between Memphis and Nashville? No, I don't think so.
You never heard of a transfer?
Yes, I've heard of a transfer. But every time you have a break in that, you lose efficiency. In other words, one of the calculations is a lot of Americans don't like to transfer. Americans, the public transit to an American is the little van that takes you to the rent-a-car counter somewhere, That's when Americans ride a bus. It's like, I'll ride a bus. You know that bus that takes you to the rent-a-car place? I've ridden that. And then, again, in Europe, when you get into the cores, there's this giant there. So I think it's a combination of both an evolution of land use. We're adding 100 million people. I'm sure our cities will get more. High scale, big scale. You see it here. You see it around the country. And they're being reinforced by local transit systems. In other words, when you get there, can you transfer onto another form of rail or another form of effective public transit? In odd places, you can. In Vegas, there's always a cab. In New York, there's a whole subway system. In Washington, there's a subway system. Every place that has that quality can get that capacity, and it would probably function. And remember, it would require a subsidy, as do all forms of transportation. Every road, you think just your taxes are paying for the roads out of the gas tax? How much more they have to kick in on that thing, just all the impact. So the Europeans have just accepted that mobility, goods and movement of people and all that, is critical for competitiveness. And so have the Asians. We're on some other page on that. We may prove right. Maybe the aircraft are so effective and so light and so, that we were smart. We'll see.
So you're talking about enormous growth and enormous lot of moving around and a bunch of it happening in the southwestern part of the country, but so how does climate change figure into your thinking about that?
We agonized over that stuff. We agonized over that, over calculations of energy and oil availability. Well, one is by 2040, I don't know if you'd see full impact because it's early enough in the century. So if we built this out to like 2070 or 2080, then the projections that we looked at would come to bear, depending on how the world adjusts, whether or not it's changed its energy production and energy usage and greenhouse gas emissions. But in the shorter time horizon, you're risking a few coastal areas. Here, you could lose a barrier island or two, and Florida is the most vulnerable. Its urbanization is in the most path of non-defensible sea level rise, whereas the Chesapeake, you could maybe even seal with a sea gate like they do in the Netherlands. The mouth of the Chesapeake, problem solved for Washington. You just regulate the Chesapeake against the Atlantic. There's already a bridge tunnel and there's a shallow mouth to the Chesapeake. So there's a few, adjustments and options. And so the Chesapeake region probably less impacted, although, certainly impacted. Hey, some of the people I see as the biggest worriers about global climate change, the ski area owners in Utah are like, our season's getting shorter mysteriously. And then all the water in the West is tied to that. So, you don't ski and I don't drink. And that's the way this is going. So, but the models show peculiar things like wicked monsoonal flows off the Gulf of California into the Southwest. And it's too many variables right now.
So,
One more?
one last question?
Going?
Last question.
That's it.
So what's going to happen in the other areas of the country that aren't within these metropolitan regions in terms of, future population growth and economic development?
They're finished. No, I'm just kidding. Some will flourish. They won't be at the scale. They won't be part of how we mostly connect to the global economy. What it is some of the opportunity structure will change. So that, because they don't have connect. So if St. Louis is a little more at risk, but St. Louis could connect better to and grow and change and connect better to Chicago. So it depends on the fate. It's almost case by case. But I'd say this, that the vast share of growth in the world is outside the U.S. The GDPs of China, India, and Brazil combined already surpassed the U.S. So the developing world's economies are the key growth that we would need to access by way of markets. So not having some of these access points like this state has puts you in a colony type status relative to the leading points of entry. This state, this region's in control of its fate. There are regions buffered by this region interior to the U.S., less in control of their fate. Thank you.
Bob, thank you so much.